Welcome everybody. So we're just going to get going here on the Iowa buyer packet. These will be all the documents that will be included in the our standard Iowa buyer packet. And if you've watched the listing packet side that I just completed, these will be a little bit redundant and with like an agency policy, the dual agency potential and consent and that kind of stuff. But we're going to do this. I like to do each one of them from either a buyer or a seller standpoint. So this one's going to be from the buyer standpoint. So this first video is going to be about agency policy disclosure and acknowledgement form. And what this is informational only. This is not a contract. And again, this form is to be presented to a client when it rises to the level of the first substantive contact. So again, if you're at an open house, they don't walk in and you just hand this to them. What happens is when if they walk through an open house and they say, hey, we'd like to see this again, and you come back and show it to them, you show it to them again, and you start talking about jobs and financing and all that, interesting kind of stuff. That is when they need to understand what agency relationships are. So, and remember, so on here, there's 4 different types of agency relationships, and I usually refer mostly to 3 of them, and then I touch base on the fourth one, which is appointed agency. So we'll kind of preview this. So again, this one's a 2-page form, and is again informational only. So I'll go through each one of these individually, and then I'll kind of come back and tell you how I paraphrase it, so that way they understand that. So you go back to your pre-license course, and from as you were going through pre-licensing, talking about how agency works, just remember you have single seller agency, single buyer agency, appointed agency, and consensual dual agency. And remember, agency that just means you are a fiduciary for that client, and that you are working on their behalf at all times. And again, so the single seller agency, that's pretty self-explanatory. You're working for a seller, and they will be your client. And you're going to have a contract with them, and again, you're agreeing to act a specific way, and they're agreeing to act a specific way. Same with the buyer agency. You're going to be acting with a buyer under buyer agency, and that means that you're going to look out for them during their, your whole entire, the purchase of the property, and to make sure that they're represented through the whole thing. Appointed agency, that is, and I'm going to go over that in detail on, 2 documents from now. But remember, appointed agency just means that I, as the broker, appoint a specific agent to work with that specific client. And what that means is it keeps the dual agency transactions to a minimum. Appointed agency is usually done by a larger firm where we don't have a lot of things happening within the office where everybody knows about it. So, as an example, Nancy Henry, when she came over from Henry Homes into Keller Williams, she was not appointed agency, and therefore, as the broker, she was aware of every single thing that happened within her company. And as buyers and sellers would come in, if she had 2 agents, let's say, if it was Chris Delphs, or not, actually Chris didn't work for her towards the end. Let's say it was Sue Stanek and let's see who else was on the Courtney Self, for example. Let's say it was Sue Stanek and Courtney Self. Let's say there was a listing that was listed by Sue, and Courtney wrote an offer on it. Technically, that is dual agency within a smaller firm, because the broker is aware of every single thing that happens in there. And so appointed agency came along to be able to minimize the number of dual agency transactions within a deal. So the way we operate is, let's say Sue Stanek, now, so the same 2 people now operating under appointed agency. Sue Stanek has the listing, and Courtney Self writes on that listing. It is not dual agency because I have appointed Sue as the listing agent, and I, as the broker, have appointed Courtney as the buyer's agent. We do third-party compliance, and that's when we do our computers are locked, our copy machine has codes, and so everything that we do within our firm is really private, and so nobody has access to anybody else's stuff. So just remember, appointed agency. In other words, I appoint the seller's agent, or I appoint the buyer's agent. So, and I'll go over that in detail here in a couple more videos. So, and then consensual dual agency. Remember, dual agency is where one agent represents both parties, and in Iowa we have to give consent for that. Both, the buyer and the seller have to give consent for one agent to represent both parties. So we'll go over that in a minute here also. And then again, this down here, they just changed this year. So this used to be self-representation, and so now you only initial this if it's a for sale by owner and they want to be self-represented. So the only time this will ever be filled in is, let's say you have a buyer and you've approached a for sale by owner and they don't want to be represented, however they will pay you a buyer side commission. Then the buyer fills out all of their normal residential purchase docs, and then when you go to the seller, you go through this whole thing with them, and then they initial the fact that they are self-represented. So it actually works pretty smooth. And then again, it goes on to explain all of the duties of a real estate licensee to all parties of the transaction, and it talks about material adverse facts and defects, provide brokerage services, exercise reasonable skill, and then it separates up here. This is for all parties in the transaction, and then this bottom part is the duties of a real estate licensee to a client. And remember, a client is someone you have a written contract with. In other words, you both agree to act a certain way. So again, you're placing that client's interest above any other party, and again, it's a fiduciary relationship. So description of broker services. This just says that we're going to assist in every way we possibly can to get the deal done, and then guidelines for owner and buyer. And again, each party to the transaction has their responsibility to protect their own interest, but also we're protecting them at the same time. So again, this is informational only, and it just says it's an acknowledgement that they understand it. So that being said, I'm going to kind of run through it quick and paraphrase kind of the way I present this. And so as I pull this out, I just tell everybody, hey, this is the agency policy disclosure, and what this talks about is how you are represented within a real estate transaction. And really there's three basic types of agency relationships, and during the transaction there's what we call a single seller agency, a single buyer agency, and a consensual dual agency. And so on this particular one, Bob and Betty, I am representing you as a buyer, and so I'm going to be representing you under single buyer agency. And then any house that we look at, it's going to be listed by another firm or another agent, and they are going to be working for their seller under single seller agency. So I represent you, they represent them, so that way both parties are fully represented. And the only way either one of those change is if we get into what we call a dual agency transaction, which means I would be representing both the buyer and the seller. And if that happens, we have to give consent, so buyers and sellers have to agree to that, and then we have to sign some other papers. So, and then appointed agency is something we'll talk about in a minute, but that just says that I'm the only person from Keller Williams that represents you on this transaction. So if it's another Keller Williams listing, it doesn't matter, it's still single seller, single buyer. So the only time we have dual agency is if it's me. Does that make sense? And they say, yep, that makes sense. And then I say, this one doesn't apply to you. And then I talk about duties of a real estate licensee. Again, it's our job to protect the public, to exercise reasonable skill. And then my duties to you as a client is to put your needs ahead of everybody else. I act as your fiduciary. I act on your behalf at all times. And I keep confidential information confidential. And I make sure that I act on your behalf. So, and as we go down, so this one just says you understand the basics of that. This is not a contract. This is informational only. Does that make sense? And when they say yes, it does, okay, you sign and print and date on there. So, that makes it pretty easy, and I think if you explain it that way, most people understand it pretty well. So if you have any questions, call me anytime, and feel free to read this from top to bottom too, and that'll help you understand it as well. Have a good day.